"Stop right there. You're making the biggest mistake of your life." The man's voice cut clean through the tension, but no one knew yet just how true those words were as Sophia Bennett stood frozen at the edge of the pool, her heart pounding while every eye around her burned with judgment and quiet satisfaction. Because just moments earlier, everything had gone wrong in the worst possible way, the kind of wrong that ruins reputations instantly, the kind that sticks to your name like a stain you can't wash off. And Sophia could feel it happening in real time as whispers spread across the marble patio of the Whitmore estate, a place so massive it stretched over 5 acres of perfectly trimmed lawns and crystal blue water that reflected the California sun like glass, a place where people like her weren't supposed to belong except to clean, to serve, to stay invisible. And that was exactly what she had done for months. Waking up before sunrise, driving 40 minutes just to scrub tiles, balance chemicals, and make sure the pool looked flawless for people who would never even learn her name. And yet today, somehow, she had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons, because a $50,000 watch had gone missing, and somehow, unbelievably, the blame had landed on her. "I didn't take anything," Sophia said, her voice steady but quiet, drowned out almost instantly by a sharp laugh from one of the guests lounging near the cabanas, a woman in oversized sunglasses who had been watching Sophia all morning like she was entertainment. "Of course you'd say that," she replied, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "But funny how things disappear when people like you are around." And just like that, the line was drawn, not about proof, not about facts, but about status, about who belonged and who didn't. And Sophia felt it, that invisible wall closing in, her uniform suddenly feeling heavier against her skin, her hands still damp from chlorine as she stood there, trying to breathe through the rising pressure, because she knew how this worked. She had seen it before. Someone needed a scapegoat, and she was the easiest choice, the pool girl, the outsider, the one with no one to defend her. And when the estate manager stepped forward with a tight, rehearsed expression, she already knew what was coming. Before he even opened his mouth, "Sophia, we're going to have to let you go," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, because this wasn't just about firing her. This was about making an example, about showing everyone else that problems get removed quickly and cleanly. And a murmur of approval moved through the crowd as if justice had been served, even though no one had asked a single real question, even though no one had checked anything beyond assumptions. And for a split second, Sophia's chest tightened, not from fear, but from something deeper, something colder, because this moment, this exact moment, felt strangely familiar, almost expected, like a scene she had already lived through in her mind. And as security began walking toward her, not roughly but firmly, guiding her toward the exit as if she had already been proven guilty, Sophia lowered her gaze just enough to hide the flicker in her eyes. Because while everyone else saw a girl being humiliated, someone small and powerless losing everything, there was something they didn't see, something none of them could have predicted. And just as the tension reached its peak, just as the final judgment seemed sealed, a single voice cut through the air, calm, controlled, and impossible to ignore. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the man said, stepping forward from the far side of the patio. And in that instant, everything shifted, because this wasn't just any guest. This was Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire owner of the estate, a man who rarely showed up in person, a man whose presence alone changed the entire atmosphere. And as heads turned and conversations died mid-sentence, Sophia slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. And for the briefest moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that didn't belong in this narrative of blame and shame, something that felt dangerously out of place, like the first crack in a story that was about to break wide open. Daniel Whitmore did not raise his voice, yet the entire patio fell silent as if the air itself had shifted around him, and the estate manager who had been so confident just seconds ago suddenly hesitated, his posture stiffening under the weight of a presence he clearly did not expect to confront directly. "Sir, there has been a misunderstanding," he began carefully, but Daniel did not even look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Sophia, steady and unreadable, as if everything else in the scene was irrelevant, and that alone was enough to make the crowd uneasy, because men like Daniel did not focus their attention without reason, especially not on someone like her. And yet there he was, taking slow measured steps across the sunlit stone, closing the distance while whispers began to rise again, softer this time, uncertain, confused, trying to piece together what was happening, because this was not how these situations were supposed to go. The story had already been decided, the blame assigned, the outcome delivered, and now suddenly the script was breaking apart in front of them. "You said she took something," Daniel finally said, his tone calm but precise, and the woman with the sunglasses straightened slightly, her confidence returning just enough to answer. "Yes, my watch. It was right here, and now it is gone," she replied, gesturing toward the lounge chair as if the explanation was obvious, and Daniel nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, as if he were collecting pieces of information rather than reacting to them. "And you are certain," he asked, "that there is no other explanation?" And for a brief moment, something flickered across the woman's expression, something almost like doubt, but it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "I am absolutely certain," she said, and that was when Daniel finally turned his gaze toward the manager. "Then I assume you have already reviewed the security footage," he continued, and the manager shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the small control room at the side of the property. "There was a technical issue this morning," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "The cameras near the pool were not recording, and that answer should have reinforced the accusation, should have sealed Sophia's fate even more firmly, but instead it seemed to deepen the tension. Because Daniel did not react the way anyone expected, he did not nod or accept it or move on. Instead, he let a brief silence settle, the kind that stretched just long enough to make people reconsider their own certainty. And then he looked back at Sophia, not as an employer looks at an employee, not as an authority figure looks at a suspect, but as if he already knew something no one else did. "Interesting," he said quietly, and the single word carried more weight than any accusation that had been thrown at her, because it suggested that the story was not complete, that something was missing, and Sophia felt it. That subtle shift in control, the moment where the pressure that had been crushing her began to ease just slightly, not because she had been proven innocent, but because someone with power had chosen not to accept the obvious answer, and that alone was enough to disrupt everything. "Sir, with all due respect, we cannot keep her here while this is unresolved," the manager insisted, trying to regain authority, trying to push the situation back into familiar territory. And Daniel finally faced him fully, his expression calm but firm. "And with all due respect, you are making decisions without evidence," he replied, his voice still level, but now unmistakably final. And the words landed differently, because they did not just challenge the accusation, they challenged the entire process, the assumption that someone like Sophia could be dismissed without proof, and the crowd felt it, that uncomfortable realization settling in as glances were exchanged, as confidence began to crack, and yet the tension did not disappear, it sharpened, because now the situation was no longer simple. It was no longer a quick removal of a problem, it was something else entirely, something unpredictable. And as Sophia stood there, still surrounded but no longer alone in the narrative, she became aware of something deeper, something beneath the surface of this confrontation, because Daniel's intervention did not feel random. It did not feel like a coincidence or a moment of kindness. It felt deliberate, calculated, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to step in, and the realization sent a quiet pulse through her chest, because if that was true, then this was never just about a missing watch. And as Daniel's gaze lingered on her for just a fraction, longer before he spoke again, she understood something that no one else on that patio did. The real story had not even started yet, and whatever was about to happen next would change far more than just her job. The silence that followed Daniel's words did not fade. It deepened, stretching across the patio like an invisible line no one dared to cross. And for the first time since the accusation began, Sophia was no longer the center of judgment, but the center of uncertainty, because now the question was no longer what she had done, but what Daniel Whitmore knew. And that shift made everyone uneasy, especially the woman who had reported the missing watch, because her earlier confidence no longer held the same weight under his calm scrutiny. "Sir, I do not see how this changes anything," she said, her tone still composed but slightly tighter now. "The watch is gone, and she was the only one near it." And it sounded reasonable, almost convincing again. But Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked past her, his attention drifting toward the row of lounge chairs and neatly folded towels, as if he were examining something far more subtle than what had been said out loud. And the crowd watched closely, every movement suddenly important, every pause filled with meaning. Because when someone like him chose to observe instead of react, it meant he was seeing something others had missed. "You said it was right here," he repeated calmly, stopping beside the chair, and the woman nodded quickly, stepping closer as if to reinforce her claim. "Yes, I placed it down while I went to the water for a moment," she explained, and Daniel glanced at the surface of the chair, then at the small side table beside it, and then at the ground, his gaze methodical, deliberate, almost unsettling in its precision. And Sophia felt her breath slow slightly, not from relief, but from recognition, because this was not random. This was not improvisation. This was someone following a line of thought that had already begun long before he spoke. And no one else was here. He continued, still calm. And again the woman hesitated just for a fraction of a second before answering. "No, no one else," she said. But that hesitation did not go unnoticed, not by Daniel, and not by Sophia either, because it was small, almost invisible. But in a moment like this, even the smallest crack could change everything. "That is interesting," Daniel said again, and this time his tone carried something sharper beneath the surface, something that made the manager shift uneasily and glance toward the guests as if trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping further away. "Sir, perhaps we should handle this privately," the manager suggested, lowering his voice slightly. But Daniel shook his head once, not dismissively, but decisively. "No, I think it is better if everyone hears this," he replied, and that choice alone changed the stakes completely, because now whatever came next would not be contained, it would not be quietly resolved and forgotten, it would be witnessed, remembered, and that realization moved through the crowd like a ripple, drawing more attention, more tension, more anticipation, and Sophia could feel it building, that pressure shifting direction, no longer pressing down on her, but circling outward, searching for a new target. And then Daniel turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the group before returning to the woman. "You were in the water," he said, as if confirming a detail that mattered more than it seemed. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady again but her posture just a little more rigid. "And you left your watch unattended," he continued, and she nodded. "For a very short time," she added quickly, and Daniel inclined his head, accepting the clarification without comment. But then his eyes moved to the far end of the pool, toward a small glass door that led to the interior lounge, a detail that most people would not have considered important, but one that seemed to hold his attention just a moment longer than necessary. And Sophia followed his gaze instinctively, her mind catching up with the pattern he was forming, because suddenly the story that had been forced onto her no longer felt solid. It felt incomplete, like a puzzle missing a piece that had been deliberately ignored. And that realization sparked something inside her, something quiet but steady, because if Daniel was right, if there was more to this than what had been said, then this moment, this humiliation, this entire setup, might not have been about a mistake at all. And as the tension sharpened once again, she understood that whatever came next would not just clear her name, it would expose something far more intentional, something that someone here had not expected to be questioned. And for the first time since the accusation began, Sophia was not just waiting for the outcome. She was watching it unfold, knowing that the truth was no longer hidden. It was about to surface in a way no one could control. Daniel took one more slow step toward the edge of the pool, his eyes no longer scanning randomly, but locking onto something specific, something small enough that no one else had paid attention to it before, and the entire group seemed to lean in without realizing it, drawn by the quiet certainty in his movements. Because this was no longer a conversation. This was an unfolding reveal. "You said you were only gone for a moment," he repeated calmly, and the woman nodded again, though this time the motion felt slightly forced. "Yes, just a minute or two," she replied, and Daniel gestured lightly toward the water, where the sunlight reflected in shifting patterns across the surface, long enough for the watch to disappear. He said, not as a question but as a statement, and then without waiting for an answer, He turned his attention back to the lounge area, specifically to a neatly folded white towel resting on the chair beside where the watch had supposedly been placed. Who prepared these towels? He asked, and the manager quickly answered, eager to regain footing. Our staff did, earlier this morning. And Daniel nodded, then glanced briefly at Sophia, a look that lasted less than a second but carried unmistakable meaning, as if confirming something between them without words, before returning his focus to the towel. And no one touched them after that. He continued, and the manager hesitated, just enough for doubt to slip into the space again. Not that I am aware of, he said carefully, and that was when Daniel reached out, not abruptly but with deliberate precision, lifting the edge of the towel just slightly, enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath it. And in that instant, everything shifted, because there, partially concealed in the folds of fabric, was the watch, its polished surface catching the sunlight in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and a collective gasp moved through the crowd, not loud but unmistakable. The sound of certainty collapsing all at once, and the woman who had made the accusation froze, her expression faltering for the first time as she stared at the object she had claimed was stolen, now sitting exactly where no one had thought to look. That is not possible, she said quickly, her voice sharper now, edged with something that was no longer confidence but urgency. It was not there before, and Daniel straightened, holding her gaze with calm clarity. Are you certain? He asked again, and this time the question landed differently, because now it was not about the watch. It was about her, about the accuracy of her claim, about the integrity of the accusation itself, and the shift was undeniable, because the narrative that had once been so simple had fractured completely, leaving behind something far more complicated, something that pointed not to a mistake, but to a possibility that no one had wanted to consider. And Sophia felt it fully now, that turning point, the exact moment where everything began to reverse, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that made it even more powerful, because no one could argue with what was right in front of them. No one could dismiss it or explain it away without exposing themselves. And the manager cleared his throat, clearly unsettled. It must have been overlooked, he said quickly, trying to contain the damage. But the words felt weak, insufficient against the weight of what had just been revealed, and the guests who had once watched Sophia with judgment now looked at one another with uncertainty, their earlier confidence replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they had been wrong, and not just slightly wrong, but completely. And as that awareness spread, it carried with it a quiet shift in attention, because now the question was no longer what Sophia had done, but why she had been accused so quickly, so easily, and whether that accusation had truly been a mistake at all. And as Daniel let the silence settle once more, his presence steady and unshaken, Sophia understood something with absolute clarity. This was not just a recovery of a lost item. This was the beginning of something far more revealing, because the truth had surfaced, but it had also exposed the cracks beneath it, and those cracks were about to widen in ways no one on that patio was prepared for. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that silence, the truth settled heavier than any accusation had moments before, because the watch had not been stolen, it had not left the scene, it had simply been hidden in plain sight, and that single fact unraveled everything that had been said about Sophia. Yet what made the moment even more uncomfortable was not just that she had been wrongfully accused, but how quickly everyone had accepted it. Without question, so it was here the entire time, Daniel said calmly, his voice steady but carrying a quiet weight that made it impossible to ignore, and the woman who had accused Sophia forced a small, uneasy laugh, the kind people use when they realize they are losing control of a situation. Well, it must have slipped under the towel somehow, she said, her tone attempting to sound casual. But it did not land the way she intended, because now every word she spoke was being measured, examined, questioned, and the manager quickly stepped in, eager to repair the situation. Yes, exactly, just an unfortunate misunderstanding, he added, nodding too quickly. These things happen, and that might have worked just minutes ago, but now it sounded hollow, like a weak attempt to erase something that had already left a mark. And Sophia stood still, feeling the shift completely. The weight that had once pressed down on her now lifting, replaced by something sharper, something more aware, because this was not just about being cleared, This was about realizing how easily she had been placed in that position in the first place. And as she looked around, she saw it clearly, the subtle changes in expression, the avoidance of eye contact, the discomfort spreading through the same people who had judged her without hesitation, and for a moment, no one knew what to say, until Daniel broke the silence again. "You were ready to fire her without proof," he said, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through every excuse that had been forming, and the manager straightened slightly, trying to regain authority. "We acted based on the information we had," he replied, choosing his words carefully, but Daniel did not look convinced. "No," he said simply. "You acted based on assumption." And that word landed harder than anything else, because it stripped away the justification, leaving only the truth of what had happened, and the crowd felt it, that uncomfortable recognition, that they had all participated in it, whether by speaking or by staying silent. And Sophia felt something shift inside her, something deeper than relief, because while her name had been cleared, the experience itself had not disappeared. It lingered, a reminder of how quickly things could turn, how easily she could be reduced to a role that fit someone else's expectations. And yet, standing there now, she was no longer the same person who had been accused just minutes earlier, because now she understood something that had not been clear before. This had not been random. It had not been simple. And as her eyes moved back to Daniel, she saw it again, that same calm certainty, that same sense that he had known exactly where this was going. And that realization sparked a new question in her mind, one that had nothing to do with the watch. Because if he had anticipated this, if he had stepped in at precisely the right moment, then this entire situation might have been part of something larger, something she was only beginning to see. And as the manager cleared his throat again, attempting to move forward, "Sophia, you may return to your duties," he said, his tone noticeably softer now, almost careful, but the words felt different this time, not like a restoration, but like an attempt to pretend nothing had happened. And Sophia did not respond immediately, because something in her had shifted, something that no longer accepted the same position so easily. And as the silence stretched once more, Daniel watched her closely, not with pressure, but with quiet expectation, as if waiting for her to decide something important, something that would define what came next. And in that moment, Sophia realized that this was not the end of the situation. It was the beginning of something far more significant, because the truth had been revealed, but the reasons behind it were still hidden, and whatever those reasons were, they were about to come to the surface in a way that would change everything. Sophia did not move right away, even after the manager's words gave her permission to return as if nothing had happened, because something inside her had shifted too far to simply step back into the same place. And the longer she stood there in silence, the more noticeable it became, the subtle tension building again, not from accusation this time, but from anticipation, because everyone could feel that the moment was not fully resolved, that something still hung in the air waiting to be acknowledged, and Daniel seemed to understand that better than anyone, his gaze steady on her, as if he were giving her space, not instruction, and that difference mattered more than anything that had been said so far. "You can go back to work," the manager repeated, his voice slightly firmer now, trying to re-establish control. But Sophia finally lifted her head completely, meeting his eyes with a calm that had not been there before. "I heard you," she said quietly, and there was no defiance in her tone, but there was something else, something grounded, something that made the simple response feel like a decision rather than compliance. And the manager hesitated, clearly not expecting that kind of presence from someone he had just dismissed minutes earlier. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, until Sophia continued. "But I would like to understand something first," she added, her voice still even, still controlled. And that alone shifted the dynamic again, because she was no longer reacting, she was asking. And that meant she was no longer in the position they had placed her in, and a few of the guests exchanged glances, surprised by the change, because the girl they had seen earlier, quiet and easily dismissed, was no longer standing in front of them in the same way. "Understand what?" the manager asked, his tone cautious now, and Sophia did not look at him immediately. Instead, her eyes moved briefly toward the woman who had accused her, then back to Daniel, and then finally to the manager, as if she were choosing her words with intention. "Why it was so easy," she said, and the question landed softly. But it carried more weight than any argument could have, because it did not accuse. It revealed. It pointed directly at the truth everyone had just witnessed without needing to say it outright. And the silence that followed was different this time. Heavier, more reflective, because there was no simple answer, and the manager shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable. "It was a misunderstanding," he said again, repeating the same explanation, but now it sounded even less convincing than before. And Sophia nodded slowly, acknowledging the words without accepting them. "Maybe," she replied, and then she looked at Daniel again, and for the first time, there was something openly questioning in her expression, not about the situation, but about him, because while everyone else was trying to move past what had happened, he had been the one to stop it, to see what others did not, to step in at exactly the right moment, and that could not be ignored. "You knew," she said quietly, not loudly enough for the entire group, but enough that he could hear, and Daniel held her gaze without hesitation. "I suspected," he answered, his voice just as calm, and that simple exchange carried more meaning than anything else that had happened, because it confirmed what she had begun to realize, that his presence here, his timing, his certainty, it had not been accidental, and the awareness settled between them in a way that no one else fully understood, and yet the tension it created was undeniable, because now there was a new question forming, one that went beyond the accusation, beyond the misunderstanding, beyond the immediate situation, and it was a question about intention, about why he had been watching, why he had chosen to intervene, and what it meant that he had. And as the moment stretched once more, the crowd began to feel it again, that sense that they were no longer witnessing a simple incident, but something more layered, something that was unfolding in real time without a clear end. And the manager cleared his throat once again, attempting to regain control of the situation. "This has been resolved," he said, more firmly now, as if trying to close the conversation. But Daniel did not move, did not step back, did not allow the moment to end so easily. And instead, he spoke again, his voice carrying just enough authority to stop everything once more. "Not entirely," he said, and those two words shifted everything yet again, because they made it clear that what had happened so far was only part of a much larger picture, one that had not yet been revealed. And as Sophia felt that realization settle in, she understood something with growing clarity. This was not the end of her being tested. It was only the beginning of something far more significant, something that would require her to decide not just who she was in this moment, but who she was willing to become moving forward. The words, "not entirely," lingered in the air, and this time no one tried to interrupt, because it was clear now that Daniel Whitmore was not finished, and whatever he was about to say carried more weight than anything that had come before, and the crowd felt it, that quiet shift from curiosity to unease, because moments like this did not happen by accident, not at a place like this, not under his control. And Sophia stood still, her attention fully on him now, because she understood that whatever came next was not just about the accusation. It was about something deeper, something that had been building beneath the surface the entire time. And Daniel finally took a slow breath before speaking again, his tone calm, but unmistakably deliberate. "The watch being here proves she did not take it," he said, and no one argued, because that part was now undeniable. "But it does not explain how this situation unfolded the way it did," he continued. And that was where the tension returned, sharper this time, because he was not letting it go. He was not allowing it to be dismissed as a simple mistake. And the woman who had accused Sophia shifted slightly, her composure beginning to crack in small, almost invisible ways. "It was a misunderstanding," she said again, but the repetition only made it sound more uncertain, and Daniel's gaze settled on her, steady and unwavering. "A misunderstanding requires confusion," he replied. This looked very certain, and that distinction landed heavily, because it pointed directly at intent without needing to accuse outright. And the manager stepped forward again, clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. "Sir, with respect, I think we are overcomplicating this," he said, trying to steer the moment back into something manageable. But Daniel did not shift his attention. "Are we?" he asked quietly, and then for the first time, he turned his focus toward the rest of the guests, his presence expanding beyond the immediate circle, How many of you believed she was responsible the moment you heard the accusation? He asked, and no one answered. But the silence was enough, because the truth was obvious, and that was exactly the point. And how many of you questioned it? He added, and again. Silence, heavier this time, because now the discomfort was shared, no longer isolated to one person, and Sophia felt it clearly, that shift from being judged to being witnessed, because now the focus was no longer on her actions, but on theirs, on the assumptions that had been made so quickly, so easily. And Daniel let that realization settle before speaking again. This was not about a watch, he said, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet finality. It was about who you believed was capable of taking it. And that sentence changed everything, because it stripped the situation down to its core, revealing what had really driven the accusation, and no one could deny it without denying what had just happened in front of them. And the woman's expression tightened, her earlier confidence completely gone now, replaced by something closer to frustration. Are you implying something? She asked, her tone controlled but strained, and Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. I am pointing out what is already clear, he replied, and the simplicity of the answer made it impossible to deflect, and for a moment, the entire patio seemed to hold its breath, because this was no longer about resolving a misunderstanding. This was about exposing a truth that was far less comfortable, and Sophia felt something settle inside her, something steady and unshaken, because she was no longer standing in the same place she had been at the beginning of this. She was no longer the one being defined by others, and as that realization took hold, Daniel finally shifted his attention back to her. And there was something different in his expression now, something more direct, more intentional, as if he had reached the point he had been moving toward all along. The question now, he said, his voice calm but unmistakably focused, is what you choose to do next. And the words were not directed at the crowd, not at the manager, not at anyone else. They were meant for her, and that made them more significant than anything else that had been said, because it meant that this moment, this turning point, was not just about being cleared or proven right. It was about a decision, about stepping forward into something new or stepping back into what had been. And as the silence stretched once more, Sophia understood that whatever came next would not just change how others saw her. It would define how she saw herself. And as she held Daniel's gaze, she realized that this entire situation had not just been revealed, it had been leading here all along, to this exact moment where everything could shift in a way no one else was expecting. Sophia felt every eye on her, but for the first time, the weight of their attention did not press her down, it steadied her, because the question Daniel had placed in front of her was not about the past few minutes. It was about everything that came after, and she understood that clearly now. This was no longer about proving she was innocent, that had already been done. This was about whether she would return to the same role that had allowed all of this to happen so easily, or whether she would step into something different, something that demanded to be seen. And the silence stretched just long enough for that realization to settle completely, and then she took a slow breath, her voice calm when she finally spoke. I will not go back to work today, she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a quiet certainty that immediately shifted the atmosphere again, because it was not defiance, it was decision, and the manager blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting that response. Sophia, you still have responsibilities here, he said, trying to regain authority. But she did not look at him this time. Her attention remained forward. Steady. I understand, she replied. But I also understand what just happened. And that was enough. Enough to make it clear that she was no longer willing to pretend nothing had changed, and the guests who had been watching now leaned into the moment again, sensing that something even more significant was unfolding. Because this was not just about a job anymore. It was about position, about identity, about who she was choosing to be in front of all of them. And Daniel observed quietly, his expression unchanged. But there was a subtle shift in his posture, a sense of recognition, as if this was the response he had been waiting for. And the woman who had made the accusation crossed her arms slightly, her voice returning with a hint of sharpness. So what? You are just going to walk away? She asked, and Sophia turned her head just enough to meet her gaze, her expression calm. No, she said. I am choosing not to stay in a place where I am only seen one way. And that sentence landed differently than anything else, because it was not about blame, it was about clarity, and it forced everyone to confront what had just been exposed, not just the mistake, but the mindset behind it. And for a moment, no one responded, because there was nothing simple left to say. And that was when Daniel finally moved again, stepping closer, not in a way that drew attention through force, but in a way that naturally shifted it toward him, because when he spoke next, it was not just a continuation of the conversation, it was a turning point. "Then do not walk away," he said calmly, and Sophia looked at him, a quiet question in her eyes, and he held her gaze with that same steady certainty that had been present from the beginning. "Step forward," he added, and the words carried meaning that went beyond their simplicity, because they were not just advice, they were an invitation, one that suggested there was something more available to her than what she had known, and the crowd felt it immediately, that shift into something unexpected, something that did not follow the pattern they had assumed, and the manager looked between them, clearly uncertain now. "Sir, I do not understand," he said. But Daniel did not look at him. His focus remained on Sophia, because whatever was about to happen next was not meant for anyone else. And Sophia felt it, that moment of choice becoming something tangible, something real, because stepping forward meant leaving behind not just the job, but the identity that had come with it. And yet, standing here now, after everything that had just unfolded, she knew she could not go back, and as the silence stretched one last time, she made her decision, not with hesitation, but with clarity, and as she took a single step forward, closing the distance between them, the entire dynamic shifted in a way no one had expected, because this was no longer a situation being resolved. It was a new story beginning, one that none of them had seen coming, and as Daniel finally allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to appear, it became clear that this moment, this exact moment, had been leading somewhere all along. And whatever came next would not just redefine Sophia's place in this world, it would reveal a truth that had been hidden in plain sight from the very beginning. The moment Sophia stepped forward, something unspoken became undeniable, and the shift was not subtle anymore. It was absolute, because the distance between who she had been just an hour ago and who she was now could not be ignored, and every person standing around that pool felt it, that quiet but powerful transformation that did not need an announcement to be real. And yet what came next would make it impossible for anyone to misunderstand, because Daniel Whitmore finally turned to face the crowd, his presence steady, his voice calm, but now carrying a clarity that left no room for doubt. "There is something all of you should understand," he said, and the conversations that had started to quietly resume immediately stopped again, because when he chose to speak like this, it meant something definitive was about to be said, and Sophia stood beside him, not behind, not uncertain, but present, and that alone changed the picture entirely. "What happened today was not just a mistake," Daniel continued. "It was a reflection of how quickly people decide who matters and who does not." And his words landed with a weight that settled over the entire space, because no one could deny what they had just witnessed, and no one could claim they had not been part of it in some way. And the manager lowered his gaze slightly, the earlier authority gone, replaced by quiet discomfort, while the woman who had made the accusation said nothing at all, her expression tight, controlled, but clearly shaken by how far things had gone, and Daniel let the silence hold for just a moment before continuing. "And that is exactly why this matters," he said, and then he turned slightly, his gaze returning to Sophia, and for the first time, there was no distance left between what he was about to say and what it meant, "because the person you were so quick to dismiss is not who you think she is," he said, and a ripple of confusion moved through the group, subtle but immediate, because the statement did not fit the narrative they had constructed, and Sophia felt it, that final threshold, the point where everything would be revealed, not just to them, but in a way that would redefine everything moving forward. And Daniel did not rush it, he did not dramatize it. He simply stated it with the same calm certainty that had guided every moment before. "Sophia Bennett is not just an employee here," he said. "She is the woman I chose to stand beside me." And the words settled heavily, because they were not vague, they were not symbolic, they were direct, and the meaning was unmistakable. And for a brief second, no one reacted, as if their minds needed time to catch up with what had just been said. And then the shift happened all at once. Expressions changed, posture shifted, understanding replaced assumption, and the same people who had looked at Sophia with dismissal now looked at her with something entirely different, something that carried a mix of surprise, realization, and a quiet sense of unease, because the roles had reversed in a way they had not anticipated, and Sophia remained still, her expression calm, not triumphant, not seeking validation, but grounded in something far more stable, because this was not about proving them wrong. It was about no longer needing their approval at all, and Daniel's presence beside her reinforced that truth without needing anything more. And as the moment settled into something real, something permanent, Sophia understood that everything that had happened was not just a coincidence. It had been a turning point, one that forced everything into the open. And as she looked ahead, no longer at the people who had judged her, but beyond them, she realized that this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something entirely different, something that would unfold in ways none of them could predict. And as the quiet tension gave way to a new, uncertain understanding, one thing became clear to everyone present. The girl they had underestimated was never meant to remain in the background, and what they had witnessed today was only the first glimpse of what was truly coming next.